Okay, this is the high tech Deadpool session. We have wonderful Craig Henighan here, who's like a supervising sound editor and mixer of this film. We have Lora Hirschberg, mixer of dialogue and music. We have Ryan Cole as co-supervising sound editor, taking care of dialogue and ADR. Hello, everybody. Give them a hand. So, what we'll dive deep into the Deadpool today. And it'll be we'll show a little handful of clips, and then we'll talk about the amazing work on this film. We actually have the first clip lined up, which is the opening of the film, and for me, Craig, I think like the first thing you should maybe just talk a little bit about is just your whole collaboration with the director and Ryan Reynolds and how. I mean, how this all got started, because you have I mean, we counted your collaboration.
With Sean?
It's like with Sean.
I've
been
fortunate, right. I've been fortunate to work with this director, Sean Levy, since about 2006. So it's maybe 9 or 10 films in now, and so there's a great shorthand. And for us sound designers and mixers and stuff, having that shorthand with the director sort of goes a long way, especially when you're sort of working with someone like Sean, who's like rapid fire, how fast as he likes to work. Generally, while he's still shooting, his editors are putting assemblies together, which are getting sent to me right away. So during this film, for sure, even though we had a couple strikes in the middle of the shoot, the first third of the movie, Ryan and I both got it really, really early. And a lot of the cuts were really, really close. So, with that shorthand becomes sort of like expectations of it being super polished, super finished, and all those sort of like, stressful things. It's like, even though we do a lot of previews and a lot of temp mixes, the expectation is at the best that it can be at that level, which means a lot of sound effects, a lot of dialogue cleanup on Ryan's part, a lot of mixing, a lot of early Foley, like, looking at sections that need help with like either footsteps or anything from that. So basically you're building the track up from the beginning with someone like Sean. So there's no real definitive like editorial process and then mix process. It's usually editing and mixing sort of all at the same time for Ryan and I. And then the great thing is Lora comes in at the end in this project, or near the end of the process, our final mixing. Her and Ryan do the dialogue pre-mixing up at Skywalker. They both come down and we all join at Disney, and we mix the final mix for, I don't know, how many weeks did we do, Laura? Maybe 4 weeks, 4-week final, and then notes and corrections.
Yeah, I think it was
stuff
20,
like that.
24 days, 25 days,
yeah,
something like that.
Yeah, so that's kind of the general gist of it with a movie like this, and which is a little, and definitely Laura can speak to this for the number of Marvel films that she's been involved with, that this process of temp mixing and previewing is not something that Marvel does very often. But what it affords us creatively is we can do a lot of experimenting and a lot of just trying stuff out and failing. And that's a great thing about, getting in early with sounds is you can experiment, and the sound you might do might suck. And they might say, this sucks, but it opens up a conversation to sort of like make something better, or sort of just, sound is evolutionary, right? Sound should be an evolving thing. And a lot of parts of sound editing viewed from other departments, namely picture editing and even the directors, a lot of it's problem solving in some aspect, where you're sort of like, they just fix a problem and then they move on. And then us soundies are like, but we can make that so much better, so it's a constant sort of evolution of getting them to sort of be open to sort of new things, which part of the trick is to get stuff into the Avid early, get sounds. And with Sean, I'm sending stuff, sometimes I just send them soundscapes of MP3. I'll just send it to him on his phone and just say, this is what I'm thinking for the opening. I know there's no picture, but what do you think? What does this idea evoke? What is it like? What does it do? So, yeah.
Ryan, I would love to hear a little bit about the dialogue process because, like, in this film, it's just like, I mean, the amount of jokes that just keep on coming and coming and coming and coming, and they are like razor sharp, not just like in the as meant as like they're funny, but they're also like the dialogue is just really precise. Like you can really hear every. I mean, I feel sometimes when you have these big blockbusters, it's kind of like, oh, okay, like, did I hear that a little? Like, and now in this film, it's just like, everything is just razor sharp, and which is quite amazing. Like when you think about having a superhero that has a cross on top of his mouth. But could you talk a little bit about the process of like, I would think that someone like Ryan Reynolds is probably like constantly evolving with jokes and things coming in. So maybe talk a little bit about that process.
Yeah, it's kind of, as you say, it's nonstop, right? And it's an action comedy. And not only is what he's saying a joke, but it's also a lot of it's plot driven because of how fast the movie's going. So you really have to hear every single line that he's saying. So it took a lot of coordination at first with me and Craig, finding the right spaces and the action scenes to find so that the action wouldn't totally dip so that he could have a little clip because you need that kind of to keep on going. And then when we brought it to Lora, she mixed it in great so that the dialogue was popping through a lot and stayed strong with the music and the effects all the way through. And yeah, I mean, the fact that he's behind a mask for the majority of the movie means that he can say whatever he wants, whenever he wants. And we're fortunate. The mask was pretty transparent. So I would say like half of what you're hearing is what is coming from production. And then the other half is ADR, and that ADR was evolving for sure. Like Craig says, it was, up until the very last day, they were rewriting jokes and maybe not using the jokes that they were rewriting and we were trying, but at least trying to like see if we can make that joke a little bit funnier and what can we add here to make this a little bit funnier and get in there.
So
I would add too that we had to be super flexible about how we set up our Pro Tools session and how we were carrying things and what channels we were putting stuff on, because it was constantly swapping something else in. So that was a big part of making it work, was just that organization and that sort of architecture that Ryan set up. But, in the final, we had to keep it going and add to it so that we constantly, put new stuff in and try stuff out and audition things rapid fire and move on.
They're not giving themselves enough credit. So Ryan Reynolds was with us on the final mix for about 7 or 8 days. And I know I've told the story before, but these two were just absolute rock stars because our Ryan and Ryan Reynolds have this like ADR love affair, and you'd see Ryan Reynolds just sort of look over at Ryan, and the next thing you know, they would take off and go to, we had to treat Ryan had a sort of little editorial suite that was treated so he could shoot loops and they would work. So they would, I think you guys, on the final, he shot maybe 110 loops. So it would be like one idea, but he'd give you 10 different variations of that idea. And so Ryan's like madly cutting it, and it madly goes to Lora, and she's like got her set up ready to go. And it's like instant. I've never seen it happen that fast in terms of that process. Usually, you're going to go to an ADR stage, it gets cut, the select gets picked, and likely goes into the Avid. They mess with it a little bit, and like none of that. It was all like real time kind of stuff, which was fascinating. And a lot of it is like Ryan said, they're just trying to look for an improved joke. It's just a little bit like a short yard game, a little bit here, a little bit there. The dangerous thing is you don't want to ruin or wreck what has been working in the film for 6 months, only because some of the filmmakers and some of the people on the stage are not necessarily bored of the joke, but it doesn't make them laugh the same way it did the first time. So then, you're like, okay, we'll put a new joke in. Oh yeah, we're all laughing now, but is it really right for the film? So there's like that delicate balancing act that I think the three of us really had to sort of be available for in terms of the exploration, but also be like, well, wait a minute, is this really good for the film? Yeah.
Lora, that must have been like, how do you match up stuff like that? You just like so many different ADR takes from all kind of places or like, yeah.
The good news is that, well, the amazing news is that Ryan Reynolds is just, I don't know, I've never heard an actor who can match himself in cadence and pitch and just, I don't know how much cutting you even had to do, Ryan. I mean, he would like look at the scene and just fire a joke in that fit perfectly in there. And then again, we had, the recordings that were on the set have a little bit of sound to them because of the mask production sound. So we used a couple of tools in the dialogue session. One of these is a processor called Boom It that Ryan Cole found, which I hadn't used before, which is a really great way to match ADR. It kind of emulates the distance of the microphone and the turn of the head and stuff. So we kind of had a couple of settings there. And just the regular EQ tricks and, little bits of verb or whatever, noise reduction to kind of make things not kind of pop so cleanly. But it was mostly, and I think this is true about a lot of what we do, is that like 95% of our work is in editorial. I think Craig might agree with that. If you have a really well edited track, the mixing is easy because things are ready to go. They're in the right spot. There's a space for them. You don't have to do crazy, maneuvers to push something through there. It's been constructed and organized so that at that moment, that's the sound you're going to hear. And I think to Ryan and Craig, that was what, these guys did that was so brilliant and really worked well with this movie. It made it easy to mix because everything had a place and the place was ready for it. When the line came up and Joe came in, we were ready to pop it in there.
Yeah. And that all goes back to getting in early, getting it with the picture editors, getting your stuff into the Avid, and sometimes asking them to say, hey, can you give me an extra 4 frames here? Or could you do this? And I think the first little clip we're going to play is the title sequence, and it's definitely music driven. And, so Ryan and I are moving stabs and impacts and vocal efforts to sort of be in sync with the music, not in sync with the picture necessarily. So like if you listen to the sequence without the music, you'd be like, well, that hits out of sync, that's out of sync. But if you put the music in, everything sort of locks in and stuff. So this sequence that we should play is, it's a fun sequence and also allows the audience to know that you're in a Deadpool movie and it's sort of supposed to be fun and just sort of a roller coaster ride. And so we took numerous stabs at this version of this mix, but it was really, and Lora can speak to the sort of, the production value of an NSYNC song in the 90s, or versus what it needs to be for cinema size and the amount of tricks she had to sort of do to get it to feel big because you need it to feel big. And then all the sound stuff that we put sort of underneath it where you don't necessarily hear it, but you want to feel it kind of idea. So
maybe let's see it. And then we also have the steps so we can actually,
because if you think so. Let's see. We're just going to play the title sequence, guys.
Laura, maybe you could talk about the music, because
Sure.
It's so musical, but then at the same time, like apparently it wasn't easy making the music sound like this even.
Yeah, I mean the original, stereo track that we got was kind of, I don't know how you describe it, AM radio ready, like kind of crunchy in there. So the trick was to try to make it full and give it sort of dimensions. And some of the things I do is obviously EQ, some multi-brand compression so that the bright stuff doesn't pop as hard. And so it kind of fits in there better. The goal is to sort of bring back the lower frequencies. But in doing that, you don't want to make it muddy. So another trick I use is to kind of use some tools that will spread it out and give us surround images or imagery that I can bring up and down to make it feel fuller or wider on certain spots. So it's a lot of kind of playing very often like a song like that, you'll get kind of bored of it, clear of the way in. So you got to find ways to make it kind of evolve and change and hit certain beats. We used a program. I asked the music editors to do one of those AI tools, which actually separates the singing from the rest of the track, but divided it into, I think, bass, drums, and vocals, and whatever else. And I could use the little bit of that, the lyric part of it down the center to kind of give it a center channel, because it is just a stereo track. So the other thing I really hesitate to do on a stereo track like that is unwrap it entirely, so it just becomes a 5-1 or a 7-1 mix, because that sort of changes the stereo image, and I want to keep that real hard stereo feel that everyone's familiar with of the song, and not process it or manipulate it or change it too much just for the value of getting a 5-1 or 7-1 mix out of it. So I use the stereo pretty much left and right, add to it in the backs, create a subwoofer part of that, and then find something that I can use in the center to kind of anchor it so there's not a big hole down the center of the screen. So it's a lot of stuff.
But then
Also, one of the things I want to say is that it was great on this movie because, you do a sequence like that. That's like the first, day one, you put that up and you're like, okay. And then we get to the end of the movie and we usually go back around and that's when you kind of dial it in because then you really have a feel for how the whole film feels. And is this too loud? Is it fun? Or am I laughing? Am I not? Like you're setting up the audience for the rest of the movie. So you can do that first, but you're not really sure if you did it right until you kind of get to the end and you look back around and see if it was, okay, that belongs in this movie. It's not some separate event,
But it's amazing how musical the whole thing feels. I mean, it's also all the effects but also the all the breaks that's in there that works with all your effects.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the song obviously has those breaks, right? So they cut picture around that, and this wasn't the first song that they landed on for this title. They went through numerous different types of ideas for the opening sequence, but when they landed on this one, then Ryan came up with the idea of doing the dance parts from the music video, and that really set it off. But they arranged all that cutting, and obviously their credits as well, with some of the breaks and some of the sort of vocal, a cappella stuff that they're doing, some of the breakdowns and stuff. And then it was just the job of Ryan and I just to sort of support it, because you're clearly not going to put sound effects over top of a title sequence like this, right? So you kind of you need the stabs, you need the blood, you need stuff like that, but you also need to sort of maybe have a little bit more low end, a little bit more impact stuff that's maybe washed out, a little bit more diffused, so that it feels like it's just part of the song. Knowing, again, how Lora mentioned later on, we get into some real visceral fights that are actually succinct. There's not a lot of verb on them. There's not a lot of they're really precise, so this was one that it needed to feel very musical and rhythmical,
I'm thinking it would be fun to kind of maybe hear a bit of the different elements, just maybe play it and then just jump a little around and hear
what's going on underneath the
exactly.
song.
Because to me, it's also the you also mentioned before the clip, that some sounds. I mean, now they were out of sync because there was something about the playback, but then this thing where you sync the sound effects with the music instead of having them play just in sync with the image. Right. And it works so well. And for me, it has all these punctuations that for me is really also what you're doing in the entire film. You have these enormously bold dynamics where you have something that's really loud and then you just cut it off and you just have his voice kind of coming up.
Yeah.
And in that sense, this makes total sense where you're saying, Laura, about establish. I mean, this really feels like you establish the language that you'll then hear for the rest of the film.
100%. We got one shot at it really to get this right. And again, when they locked into this song, and we could ask them to give us a few frames here and there, and everybody was all on board with making sure that everything was working, then it becomes like a cool sequence versus it being a cool sequence that's not quite there, I'm sure we've all watched movies or whatever, and you watch it and you might feel something, but something might still feel a little bit off, where we just tried really hard to make sure that everything was, just definitely in sync with the music in this one, and then just out of the way, on some levels. You want to, again, there's power to it, but it's not hearing a stab or a whatever full mid-range and all that kind of stuff, which in a movie like this is very challenging to sort of make sure all the swords and the claws and stuff have impact, but are not sort of shingy and all those frequencies that make everybody,
Yeah, you talked
wince.
about that, when we talked about this, that you also had some tricks of kind of having something that in a way so action filled and powerful, but then make it a little soft on the ear.
Yeah, I mean, similar to what Lora had to do with taking like multiband compression, and just getting some of the hashiness out of the top end of the song. I did the same thing with the swords and the claws, on top of pitching everything down a little bit, just to make sure that the frequencies that were hitting the ear weren't so shrilly. I used a program called Soothe, which is it's kind of a combo EQ compressor, that I could have used multiband compression, but when I tried it, I felt like I was taking too much out of some of the sounds, and Soothe allowed me sort of just to focus in to certain things. And once I locked into that, I could play the sword stuff, or the claws. I could play it louder because those harsh frequencies were sort of out of the way. And then also, every single stab, except for Baby Knife, has a punch or a low end thing with it. So like when Logan's claws are going through Deadpool, you feel it more than just a regular stab, and regular stabs are rad when it can work in context, but in a movie like this, everything needed to have a little extra sort of power to it. Not necessarily by volume, but just by size, would be, I guess, the best way to sort of look at it.
Okay, I'm just thinking about the time. Maybe we should just move on to the next clip.
Do you want to jump over? We'll go to the void. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's bounce. So, Laura and Ryan, we're going to play the void sequence, and hopefully it won't drift, or maybe it will. So this is the first time that Logan and Deadpool fight ever, and it's kind of cool. Yeah, give it a shot and see if it starts to drift again. Hopefully it won't. So there's a scene that's obviously, they had cut AC/DC this tight with all the stops and starts, so it was really cool that we were able to sort of get all the swords and the claws sort of fighting, and they're adamantium claws and an adamantium sword, so everything's a little lower pitched and has a little bit more of an interesting ring to it. And it's just one of those fights where you want the precision to be super tight and super succinct, and the same with the efforts that, that were mixed in. And, even the last little bit there when he stabs and he goes, ooh, and then there's like two lines. And when Ryan Reynolds first came up with that, we were all on a stage and I was like, how, really? We're going to try to fit this in and this in as well as on top of everything else, But, our Ryan timed it out perfectly, and it actually makes the scene kind of, it reminds you that you're watching a Deadpool movie is at the end of the day, right? So, yeah.
I mean, Ryan, could you talk about efforts? I mean, I know some actors who really, really hate it, but it seems like these guys love it, or they're really good at it.
Well, these guys love it. I mean, Hugh especially loves it. There's the famous video of him doing ADR on Logan, where he's just running in the woods and all that. And then we kind of recreated that a lot for all this film. But so because we're temping so much, we're not shooting ADR till right before pre-dub. So we kind of had to fill in the efforts for the temps. Otherwise, they feel pretty dead if you don't have, we don't want to play the efforts front and center loud and, louder than everything else, but you do want to feel them there. So we built a library of Hugh's and Ryan's efforts from the movie, and then I went digging into past Wolverine movies that Hugh was on, or that Hugh did, and kind of got libraries from that because I'd heard that he had damaged some part of his vocal cords doing a lot of these Wolverine grunts in the past, and I didn't want him to have to do them over and over and over again. Then, of course, he comes to ADR, and that's the first thing he wants to do is like, put it up, I want to do it. And then he's, we've got some videos I'll pass to Craig of him going along with the Madonna 1 fight, the car, the grease, you're the one that I want. And he just loves doing them all around. And his are much more fun. Ryan's are much more pain. Deadpool's usually pretty quiet unless he's kind of getting beaten up, whereas Hugh's grunts there's a lot of roars to them, which is fun.
Yeah, they have a lot of character. I think that's also yeah. So then you get, when doing a movie like this, then you get access to previous films in the same kind of Marvel universe or what? Or...
Yeah, but because they're all owned by the same company, and he's the actor, and he's okay with using those parts. So we definitely we use some of those. But we built a library from his ADR that he shot as well, and then we went through, and all that you're hearing on the screen is a mix of his production, which was recorded really well. as well as the ADR. And I think mixing the two together often makes them all feel more real. It kind of grounds the ADR in the world a bit better to have some kind of slightly messier sound production ones. Because, the production ones are going to have these two guys. That was another thing, they're both in leather suits the whole time. It's just like every step they're taking is going creak, creak, creak. So we had to clean up all that. But it's also, it's a really nice texture as well when you can use it and it's not getting in the way of what they're trying to say.
That's a lot of work in itself. I mean, it's also that balancing, like having, because all those efforts also make, I feel that you connect to them. But then at the same time, you have all this battling going on. So it's like, I'm thinking that you and like Lauren Craig, you must have been like, okay, so how do we find that balance in those fights? Because you kind of, it makes it more fun and more kind of human in a way, like that you're hearing all those. But in a lot of like those kind of fight scenes in other movies, then you hear a little bit, but it's not like this. There's a lot of performance in this that you're kind of leaving space for each other, which works really well.
Yeah, I think that sorry to jump in, but I think that that's actually what makes it fun is when it's not just CG, spaceships hitting each other. It's like people are doing this, and that's what you connect to as the audience. So anytime that human thing can come in, no matter how great the music or the sound effects are, that's what people really lock into, I think. That's what they really enjoy. So trying to find the right performance and the right place for it is really important. If it's constantly happening, then you just tune it out. But having it as punctuations, I think, is really effective.
It works really well here. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's like about making it feel real as a superhero movie can kind of be. But Deadpool's never really been Guardians of the Galaxy or those kind of, so we need to ground it in that sort of stuff. And the best way to ground it is to have that person doing that effort, and then everything else sort of gets draped around that sort of world, and the guys are into it. They're totally into it. And again, can't say enough about the picture editing. They're making these choices to give us the rhythmic sort of nature of the scene. So in some ways it's not necessarily easy, but the road path, like the path is there. Like the sort of, and it's cliche, but the movie sort of tells you kind of what it could use or what it wants and all that kind of stuff. And again, with the workflow that we have, we're able to sort of try things out and we'd get feedback if a grunt was not the right way, or we wanted something more of a vocalization and stuff like that. Again, because we worked on it for quite a period of time. Ryan was just very fastidious about good character type efforts, and the guy, and Hugh, a lot of character right away. So it was just finding those cherry ones that could really stick through. And then Laura just did a great job of like planting it right where it needed to be, and everything else can kind of sit around it. Yeah.
How about all this? I mean, there's all these characteristics, like especially with Wolverine, the sounds of the adamantium claws and all that.
Yeah.
How much of that is something that, like, do you also get access to sounds from previous movies?
I've been fortunate to work on a few X-Men's and and then some of the Fantastic Fours. So some of that library does exist, and Marvel as a company likes you to respect their signature sounds, for instance. So you have that as a starting point, and then the idea about an adamantium sword and an adamantium claw fight has never really happened in a Marvel movie, obviously. So I can say a wooden baseball bat against an aluminum baseball bat, pitched down a little bit, is sort of like gets you kind of that ballpark ringy. You're looking for frequencies that are sort of just an interesting sounding frequency. The other things that are adamantium in the Marvel universe are the Captain America shield, which you had mentioned earlier today in your talk. And so Addison Teague, a great Skywalker sound designer himself and supervisor, he was on with me on this project, and he was able to sort of get some of the Skywalker Marvel sounds. There's obviously Doctor Strange, there's obviously Loki, there's other things like that. And again, because Kevin Feige and everybody at Marvel wants you to respect those sounds, you start bringing them in, and then you bring them into the world of Deadpool, and then you're sort of like, okay, well, this works and this works, but I want to augment that, or, you know, you want to really respect the Doctor Strange circle, right? You know, but other things like the claws, we were able to tweak a little bit. Gambit didn't really exist, so I did a bunch of research on card tricks and the different things to unfurl cards, and recorded a bunch of different things for that. Johnny Flame was another one, and I'd worked on Fantastic Fours before, so I had a bit of a kit already, stuff that I already recorded that I could augment and stuff, you know. So, but yeah, a lot of the sounds are around. It's just a matter of which claw sounds work. You'd be surprised that there's really not that many claw sounds for Logan. There's sort of that classic one that was invented from Bryan Singer's movies way back, and they never really, you know, it never really progressed to a different thing. It was always just really those sounds fit into the moment in the scene that it's in. So in Logan, the feel of that claw, even though it might be the same set of files, feels different because the context is completely different than what it is here, you know, so.
All right, sorry, you guys. I have to jump off because you mentioned adamantium, and I'm working on the Captain America movie where we get to learn how adamantium exists. So I'm going to go and do that now. But it's been great seeing you guys. And thank you for inviting me. And
Thanks, Laura.
A little bit of that without Madonna wrecking it all.
Yeah,
Yeah.
We should.
So that's called the Oneer.
Yeah.
And it was an idea Ryan Reynolds had, I think, in Deadpool 2. The guy's an idea machine. And so he had this idea of basically a comic strip coming to life. And it's called a Oneer because it's one shot. It goes all the way along into the bus. And I guess it didn't get into Deadpool 2 or whatever, maybe even 1. But when him and Sean got together, they figured out a way of how to sort of integrate it into the story and make this kind of cool Oneer, and centered it all around the Madonna song, which obviously pays off later on in the movie as well. So, you know, so our challenge, and Ryan and I, was just like, again, what sounds to hear when, and ever so slightly, but if you take that stuff away, just kind of becomes a music video. So it's like, it's one of those movies that, because there is so much music in it, you start sort of have to look for where can you fit in to the mix, where do you fit in to sort of makes it still feel fun, and you know, you're hearing sounds but you're not necessarily catching every single thing, because there was versions that Ryan and I had of this that were just every single thing was covered, you know, and then you're just like, well, that's just not going to work, so you start concentrating on peeling things away. So it took a little while to get this in the mix, you know. Again, credit to Laura. Once she got the song sitting to where it needed to sit, it allowed us to sort of get in there and sort of go, okay, that effort can go, this gunshot can go, this stab can stay, that kind of stuff. So
I think we should hear the scene with just the...
You want to hear it without it? Okay. Cool. So let's just we won't play the whole thing, but you'll get the idea just out of, so just like those two, the score and the source, just take those. So this will be without music. So it's going to be dialogue, effects, and footsteps, and all that kind of good stuff. Let's pick it up here, I guess, and see. That gives you the idea. So I pitched it. It's like, why do we need music? Let's just do it with effects and efforts and fun stuff, and we could fill it up even more. And didn't go very far. They were like, no, we're going to put Madonna in. But there, I mean, that goes to show you, and we've all been through it, where you just put a ton of work into something, and, you know, it's got to play in the movie. So you're sort of like, okay, I want all this stuff in, but where do you fit it in to sort of make it make sense? But you're still hearing what you need to hear. And same with a lot of the efforts. Like Ryan can speak. Ryan, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you see me?
Yeah.
Or you?
Hear you. You can kind of speak to maybe, you know, there's like the Braveheart guy that jumps off the wall and comes down with a big sword. I mean, Ryan had a lot of stuff really,
and also just the crowd stuff.
It was funnier. Yeah. It wasn't funnier, but there was funnier. We tried to fit in lines of dialogue, right? Actually little quips, and like, because Deadpool's quipping all the time. So why aren't all of them quipping all the time and saying jokes. And again, it didn't, it's like, if it was their idea, maybe it would, but it wasn't. Right.
It would have been a sonic assault. There would have been so much going on had we had a lot. We did try, but it would have been fun. But
we got a few good ones in the bus or whatever. But but you look at a scene like that, and it didn't have any production. I don't think you had any production. It was MOS.
Oh, we thought 100% MOS. We built Lora built this all up entirely from scratch.
Yeah. So
I mean, we had, like Craig was saying, you don't want to hear every effort. And that was what Lora was really good at coming in and being like, all right, my eyes are coming to that effort, because Craig and I have been working on it for a while. So it's having a new set of ears and eyes watching it and being like, you don't need to hear that guy. You want to hear that guy because that guy's front and center. That didn't mean I still had to have everything covered. Every single one of those guys that you see up there has been shot some sort of sound for. We just muted a lot of it to let the story play and not get inundated with just guys going, and we have a good variety of things, but it does get tiring. So you really want to hear Wolverine when he jumps and has the big roar and is stabbing the guy, or when the guy's like pounding the window on the bus about to die, but you don't need to hear every single person.
And how about crowds? How do you do with crowds to make that work?
So this is a fun one. I've never had to cue ADR like this, because I've never had a scene where I think this many people have specifically been killed all in a row. Basically, I broke it. I had watched it down 3 different times. I mean, I watched it down way more than 3 different times, but how I cued it was I cued it watching the guys that Deadpool kills. I cued it watching the guy Wolverine kills. And then I kind of cued it for crowd moments for like the rugby scrum when they're all kind of like pushing Wolverine against to the side and whatnot. There's not a lot of like all crowd at once, except for the initial charges and a couple of the other little charges. The rest are very, very specific. But yeah, we had a loop group for 2 days with 18 people just going down the line, being like, all right, you pick that guy, you watch this guy, you watch that guy. And then we just record them, and they were great.
Yeah. So and then like what you were talking about, like these extra lines that then didn't get into the film, was that something you did with Loop Group, or is that something you just tried out in another way, or like how did you?
I think we kind of broomed that idea before we got to Loop Group.
It was early. I actually made Ryan do what's the line in Braveheart? Freedom. So there's a guy that jumps up and then comes across. He's got a kilt on and stuff. So we were trying to pitch the idea of like that. And there's another chunk of the Warner that's not actually in there, where they sort of stop and the Welsh pool is there, and they sort of play soccer a little bit with one of the heads. And so that it might be in the deleted scenes or whatever, but that had more opportunity to put that sort of dialogue in. So that's kind of where that idea sort of came from. But once they landed on this sort of cut, it was pretty obvious that, you just had to kind of keep going with efforts and interesting sounding efforts versus it being dialogue, because you're going to hear it, you're not going to hear it. Why are you going to shut everything down energy wise just to hear a little quip from, it's one of those. And Madonna was like Sean's like Madonna. It needs to be, because it's setting up the end sequence, right, where we go into the choral version of Like a Prayer and stuff, which is a whole other sort of thing, Yeah.
Yeah, there was a story about that as well that maybe you should.
Yeah, I mean, well, if you've all seen, most of you have seen the movie likely. So the Madonna Like a Prayer pays off again at the end, and they found a version. What they wanted, or they did, they found a version on YouTube of a high school choir singing Like a Prayer. And what they loved so much about it was the feeling that it sort of evoked. The trouble was it was in a different key than Like a Prayer. So it was our composer's job, Rob Simonson, and our music editors to sort of figure out how to get it to map correctly. So once the cut was working, they recorded in London. They recorded at Abbey Road. They recorded, an English choir to sort of do all the choral stuff. And then they brought it back to the States. We were mixing it at this time too. We were close to the final mix. It's one of these scenes where, and this happens a fair bit, the scene doesn't really come together until you have all the pieces, and then like the right score, the right dialogue, the right effects, Foley, and then you that's what mixing's about, right? Like you can take that time if you have the time, or you have a filmmaker that's like, nope, we're going to spend a day on this or 2 days or whatever. But then they had to get some approval from Madonna for using the song. And I think one of her suggestions was, I like it, but could you also get a choral from South Central LA, or, a proper gospel choir, and put that in as well. So there's like 3 layers of choir and all this kind of stuff going on. And then Rob Simonson did these great things where it's what's referred to as scorce. It's like it's not source and it's not score. It's this in between where he's like trying to connect connective tissue, because the sequence is, if you just did like a prayer dramatically, it doesn't actually give you what you want for an end sequence. So then you get someone like Rob Simonson to write all these parts that go around it that give you that sort of shape and sort of feeling that you need in a big sort of action movie, of like sort of that payoff, Yeah.
And an ending. I mean, Like a Prayer is one of those 80s songs that just fades out, which is a fucking...
Well, that's actually a really good point. Yeah. At the bus sequence that we showed, for a long time, it used to just sort of fade down. And we all knew it was like, well, this is a problem. How are we going to figure this out? And that's another spot where Rob came in and wrote that giant sort of orchestral. So when they come through the bus, it's triumphant and it's all those things. For a long time during our previews, that didn't really work. So the energy kind of went like, oh, what are we going to do here? And everybody sort of knew it. But that's the great thing about temping and previewing, is you can see it with an audience or a test audience or whatever, and you're able to sort of go, that's working, this doesn't work. The energy over here is not working. And Sean, they're comedy guys at heart. And so comedy is all about timing, all about jokes, all about not just hearing the first joke, you got to hear the second and the third joke. So they're always looking for those sort of like avenues of how do you make sure rhythmically things are, you're going to hear stuff. And it's kind of like what Lora said earlier, that you have this great roadmap so that you're not mixing a final dub trying to figure out, this is like, you're trying to get this, and you're trying to do this, and you're trying to like, you have this map that's already really, really well defined. So your job is basically just to make it better, So you're not in the weeds all day, just getting your backgrounds figured out and your, all that kind of stuff. You're actually mixing more of in a creative fashion, more of a forward momentum, And surprisingly enough, a lot of films don't do that, or don't do it enough, so to speak. And for various reasons, a lot of times his visual effects aren't ready, they just, or they don't want to spend the money on it, and that kind of stuff. But comedy guys, comedy directors, action comedy directors for sure like to test their movies, because if no one's laughing, what's the point? Nobody cares about a stab and an effort and stuff like that. They, it's about the jokes and all that kind of stuff and the awesome music and everything. So it's our job to sort of support all that.
We're getting close to the end. Maybe there's a couple of questions in here from some people. Yes.
Yeah. You mentioned the ringing of
The adamantium sword versus the cloth. Yeah.
Yes. How much tuning do you do with a piece? Do you have to tune it?
Yeah, I do. I kind of like, I'll either just tune it myself just with my limited musical ability, but quite often I'll run sequences like that through Dan DePrima, our music editor. And Dan will be like, it's got to go up half a semitone or a little bit here and there and stuff like that. Sometimes I want it to rub against the music, and other times I want it to sort of sit in. This was a movie where I needed it to sit in a little bit more often and stuff, And other times it's maybe even just carving a frequency, just getting, 1.2K out or something will kind of let it sit in the movie without having to sort of chase a pitch of it too much. But I've done a number of other sword movies, and it can get really tiring on the ears really fast. So the job here was just making it powerful, but chasing some of that mid-range stuff to make sure that it's just not going to be tiring on people's, hearing, because ultimately it can be like, it can sound great, but it can be really tiring, and it's not that kind of movie. You kind of want to sit in, like almost every sequence has a big music cue with the swords. So it gives me room to sort of get under something or right beside something, so it's not sort of exposed on its own. So, but yeah, definitely pitching and definitely aware of like what key the music's in and what we can do to sort of augment it.
Yeah.
There is a great amount of low end in a film, like a lot.
Yeah.
Are there any tools, or how do you?
Yeah, I mean, well, I'm a big fan of Low Ender, and it's basically based on an old school rack-mounted DBX 120, was the old rack version of it. What's the one that just came out while we're mixing from Cargo Cult? Subquake, is that what it's called?
It used to be called Thumper. Is it Subquake now? I think it's
There's
Subquake.
a couple other ones came out. Avid obviously has that one that they like. What I tend to do is I have dedicated LFE, so I have a low ender on that. But I also run it in the mains. So what you're hearing, what I find a lot of times with movies, if you're just driving stuff into the LFE, it's kind of can be disconnected to the mains, especially when you go out in the real world and the mains don't have any, so if you can put a little bit of extra in your mains, I'm talking like, in the neighborhood of 40 hertz, 45, 50 hertz kind of stuff. What I generally do if I'm mixing in a room I'm not familiar with, the first thing I do is I sort of kind of ring the room out and I kind of listen to subwoofer on its own. And it was interesting when we played the Void fight, there's some low end sort of Jurassic Park-y type sort of like stuff. And it's hitting your amps in this room really, you can hear it hitting the cone, right? That didn't happen at Disney. So it's one of those things where, it's like, oh, maybe I went a little bit too much there. And in the real world, that's actually causing amps to go to clip, but it's just, you sort of like just have to chase it a little bit, and then I have filters that don't go below 20 hertz, sort of for that ultra stuff. I try to get rid of that sort of business, and I have two low enders, one set up for like ultra, like 30, 40 hertz sort of stuff. And then I have a higher one, which is more the body stuff, which is sitting around 75 to 100 hertz. And between those two, just on sends, I'll be able to sort of mix and match a little bit. And then I have another one that goes to the mains, and meaning the left and right. And then I'll just adjust that one to taste. And sometimes I shut off the LFE altogether and try to do a whole mix with just the mains, and then I'll bring the LFE in to sort of figure out what. It's really easy as a mixer to get into the LFE and depend on it. And it's usually the weakest link, like in a regular theater, so sometimes they're not even turned on or they're out of phase or something, right?
Translated to stereo.
Yeah, I mean, the stereo thing, we're constantly sort of checking the stereo and that, and the idea with the stereo is like, that's where sort of having low end in the mains actually helps out, right? Because usually with an LFE, if you're, doing a down mix, you're taking the LFE down 10 or down 6 or down 10 or not using it at all. And it's just adding buildup that you don't really want. So you kind of like, if you have a lot of low end in your, in your mains, then your stereo usually will hold up pretty well in terms of the low end of it and stuff. It won't feel like it's completely, like kind of what Peter said earlier today in the first talk upstairs, where you're like, he doesn't want to listen to his deliverables because he's so bummed out by the Atmos version, all of when it gets crunched down to like, 5.1 to stereo and stuff like that. But it's an important part of the job. But yeah, so.
And last question.
Cool. Well, thank you all.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks, Ryan.